Hello, I am Walter John Williams. I'm here to read you some stuff, but I thought first I would catch you up on some of the things that have been going on in my life. Um, Coming out in December is The Best of Walter John Williams, 200,000 words of my short fiction, stretching back over 30 years, many award nominees, some award winners, etc. It'll be out from Subterranean, only in hardback, unfortunately, but worth every penny, I'm sure. Also in December, I have the latest book in my Praxis series coming out. I do not have a copy of that one yet. They haven't sent it to me, but this is the Praxis, which is the first in the series. So you can start here. And I'm going to be reading from a book I've just completed called Lord Quillifer, which is, or will be, I should say, the third book in my Quillifer series of high fantasy adventures. Um, and let's see. The problem with being well into long series is that it's very difficult to find an excerpt from any of them because there's just so much context that someone new to the series would completely miss, or there's too much backstory or something. But I did manage to find a little piece here, and it's right at the start of this book. Um, and in the previous book, Quillifer the Knight, Quillifer succeeds in killing a dragon and rescuing a princess, who, through various sorts of machinations, he succeeds in making queen. And So she has rewarded him with the title of nobility, and she is his secret lover. But of course, he is just a guy. Okay, he's not a lost prince. He's not a member of the nobility. His father was a butcher, and so he and queens are not supposed to even be talking to each other, let alone all the other stuff that they're doing. So this is a problem that we will contend with throughout this volume. And also I should mention that Quillifer has managed to acquire an arch enemy who is named Orlanda, and she is a Nereid, which is to say a water goddess. And she has devoted herself to making his life miserable because he managed to offend her on their first meeting. So we'll just start right in with chapter one. You rested your cheek upon your palm as you sat at the table, your expression a mixture of disdain and weariness. I have been traveling this world of yours, Quillifer, you said, and I find it a dreary place, where the debased inhabitants employ themselves only in making it drearier. Contempt laced your words. What have your cannons and galleons, your astrolabes and hairsprings brought you but fruitless and thoughtless activity? And your printing presses serve only to better distribute to the world your own sad ignorance. Our ignorance is hardly our fault, I pointed out. And you could lessen that ignorance, were you so inclined, for you were created with the world, and I know many of it, and you know many of its secrets. How much could you contribute to our metaphysics, our history, our natural philosophy? You waved a scornful hand. You think me as old as the world? Nay, my kind grew up alongside yours, and in the early days we dreamed together and we built together. But my people learned wisdom, and yours never did. You laughed. Over many centuries I tried to improve you, but you remain obstinate in your foolishness, and now I find your whole race irredeemable. Why should I take up that useless task again when I find you all unchanged and as witless and savage as the first human to come blinking from the shadows of the forest into the dazzling light of the sun? I reached for my crystal goblet and held it glittering in the light of the candle, bubbles rising like worlds in the golden wine. I think you need an occupation, said I. Mischief glittered in your green eyes. Besides tormenting you, Quillifer. Surely that grows as tedious as the rest of your dealings with humanity. You have not yet ceased to amuse. Your wrigglings, your plottings, your absurd ambitions. I sensed a shift in your mood as if a tide had changed behind those sea green eyes. Yet perhaps I will cease my plots for a time. They are hardly necessary now. I would be very pleased should you no longer seek my downfall, said I, but how is your intervention no longer necessary? Your forest green satins rustled as you took the wine cup from my hand and drained it. A second-rate vintage at best, you said. I think you're evading my question. You lifted your cheek from your hand in order to better regard me. You tossed your head and your red hair blossomed briefly beneath its circlet of gold, then fell back into place. Your mossy scent wafted through the night. Consider your position now, Quillifer, you said. You live at court where every jest is malicious. Scandal lurks behind every tapestry. The very air breathes conspiracy, and a dagger is concealed behind every smile. Indeed, said I, the court at times resembles a congress of fishwives, only less well mannered. Fishwives are less inclined to poison and murder. Corner of your mouth turns up in a smile, whereas you, Quillifer, are at your zenith. You are my favorite of the queen. You are the favorite of the queen as well as her secret lover. You are a knight of the Red Horse and the new made Count of Selford, which is a title formerly used only by members of the royal family. You sit on the Privy Council, and even the hoariest statesman or the most regal duke is obliged to reckon with you. Do you think they love you for it? Again, you laugh. Every courtier hates you and wants to be your friend, and those to whom you offer favors grudge the thanks they offer you. I contemplate my empty goblet. You think I don't know it? I think you believe that none of that matters so long as you have the love of the queen. And does it? I decanted more wine into the cup. I think you may not live in a world of whispers and enmity without suffering some loss, you said. And in your position to suffer any loss is to lose all. For once you are shown to be vulnerable, your very friends will become wolves and tear out your throat. You have risen as far as you can, and from this point you may only fall. You held up a hand. The matter is inevitable, and I need not intervene. Oh, said I offhand, your premise may be somewhat in error. I may rise farther still. Your barking laugh was incredulous. What? You think you can marry the queen? Matters not what I think, said I. It matters what the queen thinks. I sipped the wine. It was a second-rate vintage, but then I had got it from the palace butler, who was probably trying to put me in my place. If the queen marries a butcher's son, you said, she would lose her authority faster than if she had run naked after hares armed with a pruning hook. You offer a striking image, I said. Have you met many monarchs who pursued game in such a manner? One, you said, and she was not a monarch for long. Again, I sipped the wine. There remains the question, I said, as to whether I am a butcher's son or the Count of Selford. The nobility think they know the answer to that question, you said, and it is not an answer that would please you. I care not if they please me, said I, so long as they hold by the queen. The queen has a government, and those not in power will form an opposition. But do they oppose the queen's government or the queen herself? At some point, these boundaries become indistinct. There is no alternative to her majesty, you said, so long as uh, sorry. There's no alternative to Her Majesty, said I, but submission to a foreign power. Even those opposed to her choice will hold by her. And they will hold by her, you said, so long as she doesn't do something as mad as to marry you. I'm sure the Queen knows best, though I admit that your certainty had made me uneasy. I had sent Master Redvine, a retired member of the College of Heralds, to my home city of Ethelbite to pursue inquiries about my ancestors in hopes of finding a vine of nobility, however slender, wrapped about my family tree. If I could convincingly offer a noble ancestor, preferably from an otherwise extinct house, then I might ease the resentment of my supposed peers. I was not entirely proud of this stratagem, for I had no wish to debase myself by making some false claim of nobility in order to gratify the prejudices of some well-bred fleering coxcomb, but insofar as it might keep the peace in Her Majesty's council, I would make the attempt. And of course, half the nobility based their pretensions on invented genealogy, so I would find myself in the very best company. You looked at me with your emerald eyes. Your lover comes, you said, and though I despise all your women, I think I despise Floria the least. Your lips turn up in a self-satisfied smile. Perhaps, you add, because you will not keep her long. And then you were gone, and I turned to the secret silent door through which Her Majesty soon emerged. Floria wore a dressing gown of royal red satin and matching high heels with bows. Her ladies had bound her ill-tempered dark hair with a ribbon, but it was already escaping its bonds. She carried a candle in her hand with which she had lighted her way down the secret passage to my room. The great white castle overlooking Selford has its share of such passages, through which Floria's father used to visit his many mistresses. Floria lifted her chin, and her nostrils flared as she tested the air. What is that scent? Labdanum, I think. I had an otherworldly visitor. Her brows lifted in amusement. Your fairy? She isn't a fairy, as I understand fairies, said I, a goddess perhaps, and certainly a nymph, a nereid as proudly inconstant as her watery element. Floria walked across the room and drew the bar across the door. This won't keep out a goddess, I suppose, she said, laughing, but it will do well enough against sublunary invaders. I took the candle from her fingers and placed it on the fireplace mantel. Pink marble carved with gloxinia and camellia, ornaments suited to a monarch's mistress. Floria's bright galbanum scent flooded my senses, overwhelming your own earthy fragrance. Floria's face was turned up to me, an opalescent shimmer in the dim light, and I kissed her lips. I lost count of time for a moment, and then Floria sighed and rested her head against my chest. I don't know if I fully believe in this Orlando of yours, she said, but I suspect any woman who visits you at this hour. It is you I adore, said I, and it was the nymph I rejected, which accounts for her malignancy. Floria frowned. Malignancy? It's a new word. I made it up. Do we not already have a good word for such a sentiment? Malicho, for example? Would that make Orlando a malicious then? As I attempt honesty whenever I think anyone might actually wish to hear the truth, I have told Floria about you, including the fact that you served her in the guise of the Ecoy Countess Marcella, who vanished when I unmasked you at the beginning of the rebellion against Viceroy Fosco. It seemed only just that she should know that she was the lover of a man cursed by a being extra mundane, and that she should not be surprised by any extraordinary hostility directed against me. She does not entirely believe me, I think, but is at least convinced that I believe in your existence. You need not fear her, I told Floria, for she has promised not to injure anyone I love, and I love you utterly. She looked up at me. You say she is inconstant. May she not retract that promise? If she does, that will end her torment of me, her chief amusement in the world. For rather than risk the one I love, I would make an end of myself immediately. I smiled. You begin to sound as if you believe in Orlando. Perhaps I do, though I do not care to think that my safety is bought with such danger to you. I laughed. Kiss me, love, for all her mischief has done is bring me to your arms. We kissed and embraced and went from there to other things, as you surely know if you are watching from some invisible perch. For I've noticed that, though you say that you hate and despise my lovers, you nevertheless maintain a great interest in them and in our doings together. It's almost as if you were jealous. I'm skipping a bit because it involves way too much backstory. But we enter into a scene of a meeting of the Privy Council. Following the discussion of the war, the agenda would lead to a report from the Chancellor of the Exchequer on the kingdom's financial reserves. But before it could begin, the Privy Seal, Lord Waitstill, asked permission to speak. Waitstill was a duke and a royal cousin, which accounted for his resemblance to Floria's father, at least as his late majesty was depicted in his portraits. Waitstill was large and handsome, with a clipped yellow beard and blonde hair rolling back off his forehead in waves. I felt a degree of tension between us, as I had killed his third son in a duel. Sir Brinley had challenged me after having been driven mad, part of a callous plot aimed at me by a fiery-haired goddess whose name, I think, would be superfluous to mention. I hadn't meant to kill him, and an investigation had cleared me of any fault, but Waitstill had less reason to love me than anyone at the table. Nevertheless, he was civil and allowed his handsome face to show no enmity. I could not tell whether he believed that I was truly not at fault in his mad son's death, or whether he intended to take a more subtle course to revenge. My spies in his household reported no conspiracies beyond those the nobility were wont to employ against each other for prestige, pride, or spite. Apparently, my name never came up, which rather injured my self-regard. Your Majesty, he said, in view of the contemptible answer to your peaceful overtures received from the court at Longris Regius, I beg that you marry as soon as might be, with a view to securing the succession. Aye, said Lord Pontcylls, the Minister of State for Benil. He was another demi-regal duke, and like Waitstill, he had an unmarried son whose appearance, he thought, would be greatly improved by the addition of a crown on his brow. I beg your Majesty to choose a husband, and quickly. Floria regarded them levelly. It seems to me, she said, that my sister's most unwise decision was to marry. To marry a foreign prince, Majesty, Pontcylls said. I confide that your Majesty would be more sagacious. Yet a foreign prince brings alliance in his train, said Floria, and a country at war needs allies. Perhaps I should travel to Thurnmark and marry the Hogenmogen. Pontcylls blinked his small, greedy eyes that belonged more properly on a famished hog. This conversation had taken a turn he did not like, and he knew not how to steer it back on course. He was a large man, taller even than I, with a vast barrel-shaped body and a great carpet of beard that spread over his collarbones. He had been a great jouster in his youth and had fought in King Emmelin's wars, but I could hardly imagine him now at the head of a corps of soldiers, but only as a captain of a company of tipplers and gluttons. Waitstill stepped smoothly into the silence. Your Majesty's jest is apt, he said. For a queen of Duisland to marry a mere Hogen-Mogen of Thurnmark is risible, not when there are so many more suitable candidates. Yet out of love for your Majesty, I urge you to choose from among them. He raised a gloved finger as he made his point. A woman alone on the throne is vulnerable no less in the matter of reputation. The enemy already makes the false claim that you have a lover in hopes this will injure your standing with the people. Marriage would end these rumors once and for all. I wondered at the strength of will required for Waitstill not to glance in my direction, for indeed I had been named by the enemy as the Queen's lover. Perhaps a few simple people even believed it. I know that my people of Duisland will not allow such poison to sully their ears, said Floria, and the getting of an heir, I remind, is not without hazard. For was my sister not weakened by miscarriages and the birth of her Aguila, such that a fever carried her off? Yet the heir lived, blurted Pontgiles, no doubt dazzled beyond all prudence by the thought of a grandson with a crown impaled on his infant brow. The other councillors regarded him with distaste. Floria raised an eyebrow. I am pleased to discover how well my life is regarded by his grace of Pontgiles, she said, and then her hazel eyes hardened as she glanced over the company. Yet despite his tender care for my person, I am not now inclined to marry, and I beg your lordships not to raise the subject again. Pontgiles blushed a furious red. Waitstill looked as if he'd bitten into something sour. Lord Thistlegorm, the Chancellor, spoke in a measured voice. Is it possible that your Majesty will name a successor so the realm will not fall into disorder should an accident befall you? I will not, Floria's voice was firm, for if I did, the rest of you gentlemen would tear him to pieces. Which was so true that no one dared to contradict her. Floria turned to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and spoke. Sir, will you not enlighten us as to the current state of the finances? Which Sir Merriman Sandycup began to do, speaking in that languid, superior tones that so irked my ears, but that had served him well in arguing for new taxes in the House of Burgesses. I paid him little attention, for I already knew the state of the nation's debt. The previous 2 winters I had been involved with Floria in the matter of taxes to support the war and the borrowing that took place to shore up the kingdom until the new taxes could be collected. The doors opened and we all looked up from the drawling recitation of figures to see a cornet of the yeoman archers in his black leather jerkin and scarlet bonnet, which he promptly doffed in the royal presence. He paused a moment to allow his eyes to adjust to the light, and then he advanced along the table and paused by my chair. He leaned over me. His breath smelled of barley wine, and he whispered into my ear. I have been told to fetch you, my lord. He said a dead man has been found outside the castle walls. I turned and answered his whisper with one of my own. Do we know who it is? Not yet, my lord, but either he threw himself from the walls or someone threw him. There was silence in the room as everyone strained to hear our whispers. Sandycup had his pen to his pursed lips in an expression of petulance. I put down my own pen and gathered my papers. I beg pardon, your majesty. I am called away. I trust not for long. My lord of Selford has leave to depart, Floria said. I will secure him a place by me at dinner and trust he attends. In her eyes there was both curiosity and calculation, for she knew there were few errands that would call me away, and that all of them had to do with the safety of the realm. I rose, bowed, and gathered my folder. Now, Sandycup drawled, if Selford is quite done, I hope I may proceed. I paused and put on my dutiful apprentice face. I am, and you may, said I, though I believe you misstated last year's income from escheats. Remember that the Marquisate of Eldon fell to the crown only after the new year, after the court dismissed the pre-contract, which would have legitimized the bastard son. Sandycup smiled with even white teeth. True, he said, though it makes little difference, for last year's funds from the estate were held in escrow by Eldon's justice of the peace and have already been rendered up to the treasury. Yet I thank your lordship for this factical, and I will amend my figures. I bowed. Your servant, said I. His smile thinned. And yours, I'm sure. Factical, I thought. That was rather good. I bowed to the Queen and followed the guardsman out of the room and into the white glories of the inner ward. And here I'm going to skip a good deal of puzzling over a corpse because we won't be able to come to the end of that particular subplot. Let's see. So we are going to dinner with the Queen and the rest of the council and their friends. Okay. Across the room from the royal seat was a gallery set just below the rafters where ordinary people, underemployed laborers, well-to-do wives with a free afternoon, sailors from the port, visitors from another country, watched the monarch eat her dinner. It was a long-established custom that any person could watch the Queen at her meat. I hastened to my own seat on Floria's left and bowed to her before taking my place and unfolding my napkin. Questions glittered in Floria's hazel eyes. I leaned close. A stranger was found below the wall on the north side of the inner ward, I said. He has been thrown from the battlements. You may hear a tale of a poison ring, but the ring was most likely used to carry a message. Yet poison cannot be ruled out. It cannot. I realized that the room had fallen nearly silent, as all hoped to overhear my conversation with Floria. Floria waved his dismissal. We will speak of this later, said she, and in the meantime I will make good use of the yeoman pregustator, who was the Queen's food taster, a small, melancholy gentleman who spent his working life waiting to die in some horrible, agonizing way. A footman poured sauterne into my wine cup, and I waved another footman over and asked if there was some portable item on the bill of fare. Eel pie, my lord. Surprised that the royal kitchens would serve something so simple, I told him to bring me one. The contents of the pie might have been simple, but the crust was not, for it featured a pastry sculpture of a trooper on horseback, with an embroidered design on the end of his wooden lance, the corded tritons and hippogriffs of Duisland. I wondered how many seamstresses have been employed in stitching these little flags to provide one small, colorful item of a meal soon to be forgotten. The pie had no sooner been delivered than Floria rose from her seat, and we all rose with her. Gentlemen, we will meet again at 1 o'clock. Okay, so now we're all waiting to go back into the Privy Council and having conversations and such. Let's see. More members of the council arrived, some with attendants, and Floria vanished into a circle of tall men. Lord Thistlegorm, splendid in his diamond-decked white suit, approached me and took me aside. Lord Selford, said he, my daughters have come to town. I trust they will bring you joy, said I. They will, I rejoice in them. The chancellor pursed his lips for a moment as if he were arguing a difficult case before a judge. My daughter Candace is 17, he said. Perhaps it is only the fond eye of a father, but I believe her comely. I cannot believe your eye would deceive you in this, said I. He looked up at me with that self-same eye, no longer fond, but ice blue and calculating. I should be delighted if you were to meet her. Nothing would please me more. If Candace does not suit, he said, I have another daughter, Emily. She is 12. Should you prefer her, I hope, well, he stroked his beard, well, I hope you might practice a degree of restraint, for a year or two at least, in the business of the marriage bed. I would do my best to oblige you, I said, and the young lady, of course. Since I had reached my present state, any number of fathers had proposed their daughters to me, though, of course, so far the offers had come from the knightly classes or the burgesses. Thistlegorm was the first of the nobility to propose a marriage alliance, and I knew his offer was not based on any measure of love for me. Thistlegorm had been Attorney General under Berlauda, but Priscus and Viceroy Fosco had opposed the white-clad sect of the Retrievers, of which Thistlegorm was a prominent member. Fosco executed several of the Retrievers as an example to the others, but he allowed Thistlegorm to purchase his life for 30,000 royals, most of which, I imagine, went into Fosco's private purse. In order to pay the fine, Thistlegorm had borrowed and had mortgaged much of his land. Floria had promised to repay the money, but did so with a bill on the Treasury, which would only be honored when the Treasury pleased, and the Treasury would be pleased only when the war was over and the nation's finances restored. Floria had also appointed Thistlegorm Lord Chancellor, which was an office that came with certain traditional sweeteners and privileges that would help him recover at least part of his fortune. The Lord Chancellor was in charge of the justice throughout the realm, and in Duisland, as elsewhere, justice cost money, some of which, as if by some subtle law of the universe, adhered to the Chancellor himself. Apparently, the money was not adhering as quickly as Thistlegorm wished, and he had decided to acquire the support of a wealthy son-in-law who might be expected to offer him loans that were free of interest. While I sympathized with his plight, I had no intention of marrying either of his daughters, and I would have to give some thought concerning how to evade the delightful Candace without making the Chancellor an enemy. As I smiled at Thistlegorm and inwardly calculated how I might escape his marriage schemes, I saw out of the slant of my eye a black-haired man enter the chamber, somber and scowling in the robes of a monk. I know not what attracted my eye to him unless it was his air of decision, of a mind that had determined on an action and would not be swayed. His tonsure, which shaved all hair forward of his ears, had grown out a little, and his forehead and jowls were blue with bristle. Both his hands were hidden in his robes of unbleached wool. With resolute tread, he walked towards the cluster of men about the queen. Beg pardon, I murmured, and stepped past Thistlegorm. My nerves were taut as lute strings, and the small hairs on the back of my neck prickled erect. I moved to intercept the newcomer and wondered if I would arrive in time. I thought I would need a weapon, but I had none beyond the small knife I carried for eating. When the monk's hand rose from his robes carrying a pocket pistol, I cocked my hand over my right shoulder and hurled the remains of my eel pie directly into his face. Eel and stewed vegetable exploded across the monk's face, and the pistol instantly discharged. The bonnet of an elderly baron flew into the air. I knew not whether the monk had a second pistol, so I launched myself for the monk as soon as the eel pie left my hand. I am a tall, strapping fellow, and as I ran to the monk, I held my arm to the side and caught him under the chin with my forearm, which served to toss him backward onto the marble floor. Eel, stewed vegetables, and flakes of crust spattered the air. Choking, the monk landed on the back of his head and was promptly buried under several peers and a pair of the yeoman archers. The queen was surrounded by burly noblemen and carried into the council chamber. Hold him, I said, perhaps unnecessarily. Search him. At that moment, I looked no longer at the monk, but instead surveyed the room to see if the man had an accomplice. Everyone stared back at me stunned. I saw none who aroused suspicion. Take him to the guardroom, I said to an officer of the archers. Hold him there until he can be taken to the Hall of Justice. Four of the archers picked the monk up from the floor and held him. He was blue and gasping from my forearm across his throat, and bits of my dinner trailed down his face. I looked at the officer. See, he comes to no harm, said I. If someone is behind this, he may wish to silence his minion. I confiscated the pistol from the floor and put it in my pocket. I will report to Her Majesty. I spoke to the room in general, then entered the council chamber, where Floria was being assisted into her chair by two of her ladies who arranged her skirts and withdrew. She seemed composed, and as I made my bow and her eyes lifted to mine, I saw the question there. A death, a shot, and possible poison. Were these a coincidence or something else? I would do my best to find out. Thank you for your attention.